everybody, welcome. All right, everybody, welcome. This is our first seminar of the semester, and we are very, very fortunate to have Greg Falco join us. Greg has been an assistant professor here at Hopkins for a while, which is indicative of our failure as a department to fold him in. And so one of the goals here is for us to get to know Greg, who's an assistant professor in computer and systems engineering, who is a interdisciplinary computer science PhD, and to get him involved with the community more. He's already advising some CS students, and so COVID has become an obstacle. So that's the nice part. Well, let me give some more nice part of the introduction. So Greg's a teeny bit famous. He won this 30 for 30 thing, which is like, if you're smart and young, is pretty cool, from Forbes. He also, now I want to get to the not serious part of the introduction. So first of all, Greg claims that his domains are space systems and smart cities. So that's a big area. I mean, when you look at, like, if I'm going to rule, you get all of space and the smart cities. So what's left? So Greg left for me dumb cities and rural world. He also coined this term, and I don't know if he coined it. He can comment on it, of a breaker space that he's built here. And this is a really attractive idea, and I bet you we'll hear about it some today. In terms of looking at systems by tearing them down to understand the design principles and then reconstructing them. And so this joke will be lost on almost everyone, but I've now concluded that Gregory Falco is the Fred Durst of Johns Hopkins University. And if that didn't make sense, you'll have to Google it. Other than that, I will give it over to Greg. Welcome.
Thanks, Randall. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm going to try and share my screen here. If at any time anyone notices there's some weirdness, please let me know and I'll shut my video off. I'm not sure how the bandwidth's going to hold up. Okay, so the gist of my talk here is we're going to talk about the soft white underbelly of critical infrastructure. And as Randall mentioned, I kind of claim these vast domains of areas that I care about, but at the end of the day, I think they both fall under the critical infrastructure umbrella. And you'll learn more about why this kind of all comes together in a moment. I'll also talk a little bit more about my weird background, which can help you fill in some of the gaps in terms of why am I looking at these things. So just some context about me at Hopkins. I'm as Randall mentioned, an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Systems Engineering, and jointly appointed with this thing called the Institute for Assured Autonomy. And if you haven't heard about it, you should definitely check it out. It's really cool. We are a jointly run institute by the Whiting School of Engineering and the Applied Physics Lab. And what that means for me, at least, is that I spend basically 4 days a week as an assistant professor, like all your other faculty members. But then 1 day a week, I get shipped off over to the Applied Physics Lab in Laurel, where I get to hang out in a skiff, or I get to work on stuff for the government and other sponsors for the DoD most of the time. And so it's a really interesting opportunity to be able to kind of take some of the research that I'm doing in the lab constantly and then bringing it into practice and having people start using it for really, really exciting applications. And so a lot of my students are going to have the opportunity to also do that same kind of translation path where they're building things in our lab, and then we're going to bring it over to APL and see how it works in the wild. And so that's a really cool setup that Hopkins has here that I encourage you to take advantage of, or at least learn a little bit more about in your time here, because it's something very, very unique for universities to have that pathway to take. I'm the director of what we call the Autonomy Owl. It's a breaker space, as Randall mentioned. Breaker space is an important way of characterizing our willingness to know that we don't really know how a lot of things fail. And we don't really know how things work until we know how they fail. That's at least my opinion. And so what our goal is in our lab is to really kind of get as many types of systems as we can that we rely on for our society to function in small ways and also in big ways. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then we're going to try and see how we can possibly break them. Let's throw scenarios at those things that we've never heard of before, or that we haven't really seen in the wild before. And then we try and study them from as mathematically sound standpoint as we possibly can, even though we might not always have the techniques to do it. And when we don't have those techniques, we're going to build them out. And so that's kind of what our lab focuses on. We try and figure out how these systems fail in a structured way. And so that's kind of me at Hopkins, but I want to tell you a bit more about my weird interdisciplinariness and background here. So I actually just came off of a year in Iceland, which seems like a random place to go, but I was doing a Fulbright in critical infrastructure cybersecurity there. And it was pretty much a perfect match for some of my interests because they have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of critical infrastructure. They don't have a lot of cybersecurity. And actually, they really don't think a lot about what I'm now calling like this soft white underbelly of critical infrastructure. Anything that has to do with digital components of physical infrastructure or any cyber physical system, Iceland hasn't really thought about that much. And it's more of a tack on, but it actually is the underlying thing that makes our infrastructure function. And so I was spending the past year there working with a whole bunch of companies as well as the government to kind of try and formulate a strategy around how they should be dealing with this infrastructure in the future, which was a really cool opportunity. And I'll talk more about some of the direct research that's come out of that, which is pretty exciting that I'll be starting up here again at Hopkins. But also I was just from a background standpoint, spent some time at Stanford as a postdoc. And the reason why I bring this up is because my postdoc there was in cyber policy and cyber insurance. And so it was funded by a whole bunch of insurance companies who said, right now we're writing a lot of checks for cyber insurance, but we don't really have great mechanisms to underwrite them. Try and figure that out. That's not an easy problem to figure out. Didn't figure it out, but we learned some good stuff along the way. It was an important element of my academics training because it kind of made me realize how important and how big the regulatory space needs to be in order to start capturing some of the new technology that we're building, and how companies and policymakers have very little control or understanding of how these systems work, and that leads to huge gaps in how we're able to manage and interact with this technology in the future. So these are things that just kind of really became clear to me while I was doing that work. I also continued some of my doctoral work, which was done at MIT at CSAIL, the computer science lab there, in industrial control system security. Also did some more policy work when I was doing the pre-doc work at Harvard. And this was also interesting because when I was there, I was able to kind of start looking at a policy angle of some of my doctoral work in industrial control security for space systems. And so how do we design secure Mars rovers or Europa Clipper missions? And a lot of my doctoral work was funded by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where we're trying to design AI planning mechanisms to detect faults and automated failures in these space missions that would be really remote. We don't have much communication with them. We won't be able to fix them that well when things break down. And especially we want to be able to kind of intervene if there are attacks against these systems. And so the reason why this was kind of cool, the work I did at Harvard, was I had the opportunity to write a policy white paper, which I had never heard of before, and on space systems security. And this policy white paper had subsequently been then shopped with a whole bunch of folks on Capitol Hill and in the National Security Council. And then I didn't hear anything about this paper. And last year in fall, I got a call from a buddy saying, "Hey, Greg, did you see that new national policy on space systems security?" And I was like, "No, I didn't check it out." And they're like, "They copied and pasted your research." And I was like, "That's really cool." There was some people who are actually using our work, and because it was kind of translated into this policy language, there was actual usability for some of my engineering work. It just had to be translated. So it was kind of really cool. And I appreciated that opportunity. Just to tell you how off my background is, before all of this, I didn't do any computer science. I don't have an official computer science degree. I'm very self-taught, which ended up working out really well for me. But my master's was in sustainability management. And so I was designing green infrastructure there. And my undergrad was in hotel administration, which was a total mess. But I'm here now. So I just wanted to say that you don't have to start out where you are in order to find something where you want to go. And that's really exciting. And so to give you a bit more context on what the space domains, the smart cities domains that I'm looking at, I wasn't always in academia. So I worked for nearly 8 years before I started my doctorate work. And I was an executive at a company called Accenture. It was a big management consulting company. It is, still is. And I was a strategist there. I ran their smart cities division. And smart cities was really about connecting a whole bunch of old infrastructural devices with IoT. And this was over 10 years ago now. We didn't really know as much about security or safety of the digital safety of this infrastructure that we do now. And a lot of our clients were asking, hey, what are these IoT devices secure? We're starting to like make sure that our trains systems are running on these really, really inexpensive Raspberry Pi mechanisms that were being stood up for their control. And we didn't really have answers. We kind of gave them lip service, as any company does, saying, of course it's secure. We're making sure it has the latest encryption or whatever. But I knew in the back of my head, this was definitely not enough of an answer to actually say that we've solved for some of the security challenges for smart cities. And so after, a number of years working on this, I just bailed and said, I have to go figure some of these problems out. And that's why I went into research. And so I have a lot of context for why I look at the problems I look at. And you'll notice that there are flavors of practice throughout a lot of the research I'm doing, and trying to make as much translation work happen as possible, where we're doing really important fundamental basic science and research, but we want to always bring it into the field. And so worked with some other fancy companies, which has been a really fun experience in the past. I had a startup that did industrial control security, worked with utilities around the world. So all of this kind of informs what I'm going to share more with you about some of my research path later today. The reason why I have these people over here, that's my family. You'll hear them possibly screaming upstairs, or they will maybe just shut off the internet at some point because they want to watch Netflix. But they're always around, and you'll see them around my lab if you ever stop by. So to give you some context here, what I'm going to talk to you about is how we have a lot of this old infrastructure in our country, a lot of old systems that we rely on for everyday function. And that's kind of how I characterize what critical infrastructure is. It's just these devices, these systems, these big, bulky, often non-digital assets that we rely on for anything. Roads, buildings, like the electric grid. These are things that we just don't think anything about. But increasingly, we've kind of instrumented them to have a digital component to them, to make it more easily accessible, and to actually figure out how to optimize, make more efficient from a sustainability standpoint, but also just from an operational capacity standpoint. But when we started pulling all of these digital systems together in order to actually make for what we thought ultimately more robust infrastructure, it was kind of done in a very haphazard way, right? And the mess that we've kind of created for ourselves is that, the digital systems that we've pulled together in a hodgepodge manner, they don't always work as we expect, because it wasn't part of the original strategy of how we're going to design and implement these very complex cyber physical systems that are our infrastructure that we live with. And so what I like to look at are all of these components that maybe weren't put together in a very strategic manner, or they're old. Maybe they were kind of starting to be instrumented from a digital standpoint in the 80s, or older, even when it comes to some of the older electric infrastructure, and the networking capacities behind them. And we need to figure out how to make them work for today's standards or today's expectations of the world. And this is not always such an easy task, because you're dealing with a whole bunch of different legacy stakeholders, and you're dealing with a whole bunch of different vendors. So it kind of creates this big mess of stuff that we rely on, but we really can't rely on it because we don't know what's inside it all the time, and we don't really always know if it's going to work. And a lot of this can be summed up in just public news by looking at the infrastructure bill that's been being pushed recently. And you see a lot of, and these are all just news clippings just from the past 6 to 9 months. Just a lot of times our infrastructure fails, and this is in the US. I'm not looking at a country that's still developing or in its early phases of development, as we call economic development, as we call it. But this is in the U.S. We often have infrastructure failures when there are extreme events like hurricanes, or the pandemic may exacerbate some of these challenges. But these things shouldn't really happen. There's a reason why we can make things better. We can make things better, and we just haven't spent the time or money or focus on improving some of the digital components of this infrastructure so that it's more reliable. And so the infrastructure bill that's been put forward, it's sometimes contentious, but at the same time, it is bipartisan because everyone realizes that we have an infrastructure problem in this country and we need to do something about it. And when you think about infrastructure, a good way of kind of starting to sum it up is through the lens of a smart city, because otherwise it becomes very unrelatable to people. And when you think of a smart city, you think, well, we have a whole bunch of systems that we rely on for our function that we maybe interact with every day: energy systems, transportation systems, connected dog collars, security cameras and systems, maybe UAVs that would maybe ultimately deliver packages for us, but right now are really fun spying tools. I'm not sure what people use it for recreationally, but there's a whole bunch of use cases there. And then other areas also get roped into smart cities, which you might not think of, which is space systems. Because actually a lot of our terrestrial systems for digital assets are reliant on space systems to function. For example, future self-driving cars, they're going to have a lot of GPS requirements, assuming that we don't fully rely on CNNs for navigation. That's a big dependency. And electric grids require the timing function of satellite systems in order to kind of line things up. We rely on global and satellite communication mechanisms for agricultural industries. And so these are things that we don't really think about space systems for, but it's pretty fundamental to how our cities develop, which is one of the reasons why I started looking in that area. And these things are all connected, right? It's not like we're just looking at an individual security system or an individual smart metering system or renewable energy. No, we're looking at the mesh that's needed to be created for these cities to function. And that further complicates how we deal with our infrastructure. And so when we have smart cities, the underlying component is people want them to be safe and secure, right? That's the reason why we'd really want a smart city. Yeah, maybe we want to save some money. Maybe we want people to give us some nice marketing and say, hey, people come to our city because we're so smart. That's another reason. But at the end of the day, safety and security are usually paramount importance. And we want to drive this. And there's kind of three areas that I look at for why different cities have rationale for smart cities. They want urban resilience. So when it comes to having natural disasters or things of the like, they want to make sure that they're able to kind of bounce back pretty quickly. They want safety and security as a fundamental component, or they want to improve public health. And so the icons you see on the right here, these are projects that I've worked on in the past when I was at Accenture, where each of them kind of said, I need a smart city because of one of these three things. And the way we end up getting there, and the way we actually achieve smart cities is a lot of money usually, but more tactically, you need a lot of network devices that need to be dependable. You need to automate a whole bunch of your systems. And that means you have to have a very intense sensor mesh and actuator infrastructure. And then you also need actual infrastructure that can be both from a terrestrial standpoint or from a space standpoint to facilitate all these services. And it's not always so clear how you actually be able to pull all of these things together in order to drive to this objective, which is maybe urban resilience, safety or security, or public health. But rarely do you ever see cities say, we're going to be smart just because we want to be smart. Now they have a purpose. And so it's important to think of that when you're trying to figure out how to instrument those cities with the technology that you actually care about. Yeah, it needs to be secure every time, safe and secure. That's always kind of the underlying component of these things. So let's talk a little bit about one of the recent projects I've worked on. How do we inspect infrastructure today? Does anyone, if we were in a class, I would ask anyone have any ideas, but maybe I'll just answer some of these things myself. I'm not sure how interactive this is supposed to be. But this is a picture of a utility line in Iceland. You might see something on there that you might not want. It's a lot of ice. Ice is not really good for power lines. And that might be obvious, but the reason is because it can result in a whole bunch of coronal mass discharge, where basically you have the energy that is in electricity that's in the wire is starting to kind of expand out, and it could start jumping between the wires, and that's really bad. When that happens, you can create shorts in the system. Also, the ice can just kind of pull the wire down so far that the line will break. That's not good. It can just pull down far enough where people may touch it by accident. I'm not sure. There's a whole bunch of problems with ice, and that happens obviously in countries where it gets really cold, but also happens in places like Chicago or a lot of areas in the north in the US. And so we want to figure out how to inspect these lines to make sure that we don't have icing in a crazy way all the time. And as one of the ways that people deal with this is that they have a lot of manual inspections. And so they have dudes or dudettes going up in helicopters and just kind of checking out when there's icing on the lines or there are defects on the line. And so it's not always about icing, right? I want to look at defects when there's problems with these lines. And this is not just about for really cold climates, but think about in the west, on the West Coast, where we have all of the wildfires. Many of them had, over the past couple of years, have been prompted and started by downed power lines that maybe just sparked a little fire that became a massive, devastating event for the country. And so these are things that we need to start inspecting this infrastructure a bit better. And the way we do that is kind of archaic. We have these helicopters, people go up in the helicopters and check them out. This is something that we've done for a while. Also, kind of funny, I couldn't find a great picture of it, but when I was in Iceland, I saw some really funny pictures of helicopters going up with big logs tethered to the helicopter. And the way they de-ice some of those lines is they knock the log into the line and they try and just get the ice off. So not only is inspection done by a helicopter, but sometimes they just like try and knock off ice or do the fixing by the helicopter as well. Doesn't seem super efficient, and it doesn't sound very 21st century of us. So how do we do this a little better? Well, one way that's done a little better, and I'm just going to give you this example as one of many ways that people are trying to improve this. This is a company that is started out of Iceland. It's called Lockheed Power. And what they do is they have this box, and the box uses the energy from the power line to be able to charge a whole bunch of random sensors. And I say random because it's really about the utility who chooses what sensors go into this box. So he uses this box to power a whole bunch of sensors that are in the box. And one of the potential use cases for this box is to put a video camera. And so the video camera will be able to monitor the line, and then you may be able to have that, and that's connected to a command center somewhere, and you have a person looking at all of that video footage and seeing, hey, there's a break in the line or something happened here, we should go do something about it. Now, this is a step above being able to do the helicopter, but it's still not perfect. And you can think of a number of reasons why. One is because, honestly, you might have to have a lot of these boxes floating around, especially if you have a whole bunch of utility line out there. Like, you're gonna need a lot of boxes because the field of view of a camera is only gonna go so far, especially if you're in a mountainous region where you're not gonna be able to see that far with one box. That's one of the constraints. Other constraint is you're streaming a lot of data back to that command center. And so that could possibly add up from a cost standpoint. And I think utilities realize this, but they also see that this box is better than having helicopters go out and seeing what they can do. So this is a startup company. Remains to be seen how well they perform in the market from a feasibility standpoint. And also it remains to be seen how many use cases they can come up with all the sensors that live in their box, because maybe they're going to be doing things more than video in there. They claim to have a GPU that's inside there, but I looked at the specs of the GPU and it was a pretty sad GPU, so I'm not sure what it can actually do. But it remains to be seen if this is an effective means of not monitoring this. But we thought, why aren't we using UAVs for servicing and inspecting these utility wires? And UAVs are being used to do this in some capacity. For example, Landsnet, which is the largest utility in Iceland, they just bought a $100,000 drone to be able to have a pilot fly up and down the utility lines and take video images of them for deep inspection. Now, again, this is maybe slightly better or equivalent to the Lockheed Power box, because you're still collecting, you're still requiring a device that is able to capture video data. You have to send that data back somewhere, or you have to kind of have it stored on the drone's edge. And then, when the drone comes back to the operator, after it's flown back to the operator, they can take the SD card out and go upload it to the video camera and then go look at it. But that still doesn't feel 21st century enough for me. So what we were thinking is, okay, well, first, wouldn't it be cool if we can have this drone fly in a way that is autonomous? And that way, we don't have to have a trained flight operator. And in Iceland, there's not the same regulation as there is in the US. So I'll just start by saying that, because regulation does play into this quite a bit in the States. But we're saying, why can't we have this drone just fly up and down the utility lines and then capture this imagery, and we can then upload it back in our shop here in the command center. The other thought is, wouldn't it be cool if we're able to actually not only just capture video from this system, but we were able to do deep inspection of defects and monitor and the drone can then zoom in on the defects that it can find, and then kind of flag that information for a operating team that would then be deployed to actually go fix the wire where it needs to be fixed. And so that was kind of the vision, the thought process. So we built this drone out of this little kit. We started instrumenting with a whole bunch of stuff. We put a depth camera on there. And we started thinking, okay, well, what would make this process a little easier? Well, let's try and do some of this on the edge. And there are a lot of benefits to doing this activity on the edge. One of the benefits is that by doing so, you're not necessarily having to have that drone stream any data from a communication standpoint back to a command center, especially if it's high def video feeds for some reason. Like that's expensive and you don't want to deal with that. Also, if you were able to do some of the processing on the edge, you'd be able to use that for real-time decision insight for the autonomous function of that drone. And so we started thinking, okay, well, how are we going to be able to do this? Well, we found these pretty cool devices. Some of you may have played with them before. They're called Jetson Nanos. It's by NVIDIA. And they're really tiny. They're like this big. And they are decent GPUs that can do video processing. And so we started buying a couple of these things to play with. We broke one of them, at least, broke two of them, at least. We break a lot of things in our lab, but that's why we call it a breaker space. And so we bought a couple of these. We also bought these things called Google Corals. Those are also, they're TPUs, they're not GPUs. And they're also really, really tiny. We tried using these as well to start doing some video processing on the edge and had some interesting results. When we started shrinking to the edge, or first thing we did is we started capturing a whole bunch of video footage outline. And I just built the slide so I can kind of talk through some of these images. Started collecting just random video footage of utility lines in Iceland. Here's like one of the initial images. As you can see, it's a pretty basic, image to start processing. And so there was already existing a project called LSNet, where the team had tried to be able to correctly capture and identify where those lines were at any given time on a very, very basic data set. So we tried to implement this on a couple of data sets that were in Iceland. And we noticed that it works to some extent, but it is not perfect from an accuracy standpoint. However, when we were thinking about the goal of autonomy for the function of this drone, we realized we didn't actually need a perfect line every time when it came to actually analyzing and monitoring this utility structure. We just wanted to know where the line was, generally speaking, so that the drone could fly along the line as the point of reference. And then using the depth camera, we'd be able to kind of say, hey, stay this far away from this line at any given point in time. So even if we end up having a whole bunch of breaks in our line that is developed by our CNN, didn't really matter all that much because we had a big field of view, and we'd ultimately be able to find a different line, and we can average those frames to be able to get better visibility. So started to fly along these lines, started to actually start deploying. Well, we redeveloped this team's LSNet convolutional neural network because the code was not open source for that. And so tested it on our Icelandic data set. Works pretty well. I'll be able to capture the lines. It uses a mechanism to do this that's fairly efficient to begin with, because it doesn't look at every pixel across the entire image. What it does is it looks across the 4 quadrants of the image and just tries to find pre-trained line, like we pre-trained it for detecting line segments. And so it looks for lines within each quadrant. And after it's able to detect the line in the quadrant, that's when it then we have a second order priority analysis to find which pixels represent the line. We just capture all of those line segments in there. And then we average, or using a least squares analysis, able to average out where the line is and project or guess where the line ultimately is for the visibility of the drone. And so that's kind of how the LSNet functions. But this was definitely not going to work on the edge of the device. So we needed to figure out how to shrink it. And we tested a couple of mechanisms to do so. There's a number of ways of shrinking things to the edge. What we ended up trying to do is we built these 2 different convolutional neural networks that would be able to be performant on our edge. Because when we put the LSNet on the Jetson Nano, we were getting like 3 frames per second, and that was not sufficient to do any kind of autonomous function or any defect or inspection detection that was necessary for what we cared about. And so we first did something where we looked at how do we reduce the number of channels that were analyzed by the Jetson Nano. And so we shrunk it down by 1-by-1 convolutions, and it just resulted in a much smaller network overall, and it gave us 9 frames per second ultimately, which was better than 3 frames per second. And then we had another idea. We said, okay, well, let's have all the channels that are available for each layer of the model. And by doing so, we ultimately ended up with 27 frames per second, which was pretty good. Now, when this happened, our accuracy started dumping pretty quickly. However, you'll see each of these images, while from a numbers standpoint and the metric standpoint, which you can find over here, the numbers went down, the accuracy went down. Actually, looking at the lines themselves, it's not all that terribly different. It's still able to detect these lines. So it's still useful when we're thinking about it from an autonomous function standpoint. Maybe if we were going to use the LSNet for actually doing the incident detection and figuring out, okay, well, is there a break in the line here? That may be slightly less reliable as we're shrinking this model. However, the primary use case to start was, can we make this thing be able to detect where the line is so that we're able to fly along it autonomously without an operator? And so we published a paper, or we got a paper accepted at a conference on this one, and on how we're able to shrink this thing down. And what we're now working on is being able to feed the insight from these lines that we've created into the flight controller and actually do the autonomous flight. Now, we've tested this 3 times. It works. We have not finished our paper on it yet. But when I say it works, it barely works, meaning that we often are coming up with a bunch of anomalies for how this drone is performing and acting. And we actually think it has something to do perhaps with the electromagnetic interference with the controllers on board of the drone. Because when we borrowed a $100,000 drone, we didn't have any issues for our autonomous function planning. But when we used our $600 drone that we built ourselves, it did not work so well. So we're trying to understand a bit before we publish this paper, like, what is this thing consistently going to work, especially when we're looking at safety and security of this infrastructure. Another part of the project that we're going to be working on in the near future is how to take this LSNet and do a multi-layer multitask model, and be able to start training it to find defects in the towers themselves. And that's an incremental step, but it is a different line of research that we have yet to pursue. So this is kind of a cool example of where we are not looking at how to solve for the underlying digital layer of the electric grid itself, but how do we do the inspection in a digital way that's optimized for the 21st century? Another use case that I want to share with you, kind of going to another means of interest perhaps, is what you see here is a constellation of satellites, communicating with a vehicle or a whole bunch of other moving systems. Now, when we have self-driving cars, we are going to be somewhat reliant on GPS systems, at least at first. And the problem that we're going to have with this is that we're going to have some crashes. And this crash that is from an autonomous vehicle. It was a Tesla. It's not fully autonomous, but they like to call it that. And the FTC is pretty mad about this right now because they're marketing inappropriately. But anyway, you will have vehicles that crash because we will have anomalies in how direction navigation are working in these self-driving cars in the future. And some of you may recognize this image for whatever reason, but it's Pokemon Go. And Pokemon Go has kind of disrupted the security of a lot of PNT systems, position, navigation, timing satellites. The reason why is because when Pokemon Go first came out, it was really fun. It's an AR game on your phone, and especially kids were running around trying to catch the Pokemon on their phone. But you need to be in a specific location to catch certain Pokemon. So it depends on really where you can be in order to catch certain types of Pokemon. So people started thinking, oh, well, wouldn't it be cool if I can spoof my GPS location in order to get around the programmable function of this game so that I can go catch new types of Pokemon? Now, that's a great idea. However, making spoofing technology available to the masses is not always a great idea because it ultimately disrupts the whole area that the GPS signal is going to if you use strong enough of a signal. And most of these people who are game hackers, they didn't really care about anything else other than catching their Pokemon. So it didn't always work out always in the favor of things that we actually needed to rely on from a GPS standpoint. And so the security of these PNT systems of the GPS signals is of paramount importance for these vehicles, these self-driving cars. And right now I'm doing some consulting work for the World Bank where they're trying to design new regulation for one of their member countries for autonomous vehicles. And one of the challenges that they're having right now is they're really not able to engage they're not really able to have security regulation there that is, or the country that's using this, and I can't speak to some of the specifics, but they can't actually instrument or require any specific security regulation for the satellite systems that are providing the GPS navigation, because that agency that is running the transportation system is not able to work properly for whatever reason with their satellite communications network. And so it kind of creates this very intricate mess of challenges and interagency operations that have to kind of work out for self-driving cars ultimately to be safe and secure. So one project that we recently stood up, and I encourage everyone to check out, is a demonstration of ways that you can break into different CubeSats. And I'm teaching a class right now that kind of goes over how you would break into and how you would disrupt different satellite infrastructure operations, and that would ultimately have impacts on terrestrial systems that would be critical infrastructure. And so for those of you who aren't super familiar in the space, usually space systems have three different kind of core components. Forgive me for those of you who know more about this, and I'm kind of glossing over some important things, but just for purposes of the call or this discussion, you have the space vehicle, it's the thing in the sky. You have the comm signal, what communicates between the ground and the thing in the sky. You have the ground station. And the ground station pretty much acts like an industrial control system, like any other control system you'd have in a electric grid or other kind of SCADA type network. However, the space vehicle kind of actually operates like an IoT device. It's just a very far remote device, it happens to live in space. It's radiation hardened, obviously, and it communicates with things on the ground using a comm signal that, again, operates like any other comm signal that we may have terrestrially. So we wanted to kind of go through an exercise, and I was working with some colleagues at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as well as a company called SciZone, who develops space systems for the Air Force and does a lot of work with NASA's Artemis plan. And so we tried to develop an attack tree to help developers of these space systems that might ultimately be used for position navigation timing purposes for infrastructure to be able to evaluate what are the threats to their systems and how you break in. And for those not super familiar with attack trees, it's basically a mechanism to plan out how you break into a system, or how an attacker or a hacker would kind of use to their plan to break into an asset. And at the top of the tree is a series of goals, and they kind of work their way through the plan in order to ultimately demonstrate how your attack would work. And so we came up with this nice fancy ontology that would help plan out how our attack trees would be structured. And then we demonstrated a series of scenarios that would help to show people why this matters. Because one thing that is not very clear right now in the space world is, why do we care about security attacks on these systems? Well, for me, it's obvious because we have a lot of terrestrial systems that we really need to be relying on space systems for. But the space operators don't always quite see it. There's like, oh, well, we're doing this for scientific exploration. Why does this matter? Maybe we'll lose a little bit of data. So these are questions that we constantly have had. The conversation is beginning to change a little bit, but we wanted to help them understand why it matters. So we kind of planted 3 scenarios, and we planned these out in these different attack trees that we had, and then we ultimately demonstrated them. And one of the scenarios we were able to demonstrate out was we created denial of service for the CubeSat operator. And what this was about was actually not a denial of service just on the ground station or the control, but we flooded the CubeSat with commands, the CubeSat itself with valid commands. And because the CubeSat has limited processing power in space, it wasn't able to execute commands that the operator actually sent it in a timely manner. It was ultimately able to submit the or execute on the command that it was supposed to do. However, because space has so much nuance in terms of when it's supposed to communicate with the ground station, if you're able to flood the command line with a whole bunch of operators, then the timing won't work out for the operation that you actually want to accomplish. And so ultimately, this created a huge annoyance for the CubeSat operators to show them, if just in case someone gets access to your comm signal and finds that CubeSat you have, which is actually not terribly hard to do, and my students are learning about how to do that in class. You can ultimately make it such that there's a timing attack against this asset, which is pretty sad and bad given how much money it costs to make that asset work. We also were able to demonstrate another attack on modifying the data sent to the CubeSat. And we also did another scenario where we uploaded a whole bunch of malicious applications to the CubeSat, totally killed the radio, and made the thing a piece of junk in space. So these were all fun to do, to first kind of plan out in these attack trees, which we just published a paper on, but also we're able to kind of demonstrate. And we demonstrate them. We just did another demonstration at DEF CON this year, and we every year do a sandbox testbed environment exercise with people to demonstrate these programs and these attacks out at AIAA Ascend, which is a big aerospace conference that happens each year. And so for my lab specifically, we just bought a CubeSat, a 3U CubeSat that is meant to be a testbed for hacking. And so ultimately, we will send this thing into space. It's arriving. The components of this CubeSat are arriving in the next 3 weeks to our lab at the IAA. And we're going to allow anyone who wants. We're going to open it up to the Hopkins campus, also opening up to the Stanford campus because it's done in collaboration with my colleagues there. To anyone who wants to try and hack into this thing and write some papers on it with us and demonstrate some cool things, it's going to be open to the community to do so. And then we're going to try and launch it in space and then see if we can hack into it when it's in space and make it fall out of the sky. That's kind of the goal. So that's something that's cool. It's coming soon. And I know that I'm getting close on time, so I'll make this last one brief because I want to leave some time for Q&A. But one thing that we don't always think about when it comes to critical infrastructure is how healthcare is critical infrastructure, and also the social networks that we use to communicate about healthcare systems are also part of our critical infrastructure, essentially, because we rely on these things to function. And there's a whole bunch of social media forums that people use to get information about diseases that they may have, be able to kind of form communities with others with that disease. And Inspire is probably one of the biggest ones that are out there. Facebook also has a whole bunch of groups that are available to people with certain illnesses. And so one thing that we were trying to think about, that my lab was working on, is how do we combat a whole bunch of misinformation that's going on about different diseases? And it's not so easy to do, obviously, but one way we were able to think about it is, let's choose a single topic, single disease, and let's start collecting a whole bunch of data that we can find on this Inspire forum. And so we scraped millions of these posts that people have started making on Inspire. And when we did this, we said, well, let's figure out how we can catalog this in a robust way. So using natural language processing tools, we started to begin piecing out what people are sharing on these forums. For example, so for the use case that we tried first, it was with breast cancer. And so we started looking at all of these breast cancer posts. By the way, it's incredibly sad. It's a very depressing project to start out with. Don't recommend it on things that maybe hit home really closely, but it's very, very interesting science that we ended up with. So ultimately, we got all of this data about people in the it's self anonymized on the forums based off of how we were able to aggregate it. However, we were able to start categorizing things into different demographics, because people share a lot of demographic information about themselves. They also share information about their genetic markers that resulted in some of their disease. And so we started cataloging a lot of this information and have created from this catalog patient journeys, abstracted patient journeys that will help people with certain illnesses maybe find others in a more concerted way that have similar maybe demographics, but also similar lines of illness. And also using this information, we'd be able to start tracing down lines of treatment that people have talked about on these forums. So it became a very interesting data set that was incredibly rich with information about all of these illnesses that are out there that people are self-reporting and making available to the public, because this is a public forum that they're posting on. And we started to catalog this and then abstract those, what we call patient stories, patient journeys, such that if someone who has breast cancer wants to put in information or kind of ultimately find their demographic group and then put in a little bit of information about what their own condition is, they'd be able to find our abstracted patient journey for other people with similar illnesses. And the vision here is we would want to help empower individuals to see what other people's lines of treatment were, and then develop a medical dictionary to do sentiment analysis on different treatments that were done by different people of different patient journeys, and then ultimately use this information to empower individuals to take information to their doctors saying, hey, I had this patient journey. This person has similar characteristics to me. They had this treatment at this point in time of their treatment path. Can we see if we can try this? We're not trying to replace medical practitioners by any means. I'm never going to make claim to know anything about this stuff. However, we're trying to provide tools to patients in order to do this. And so right now we are in a final round review of a major grant that would help us facilitate this research in the future. And we have a pretty interesting use case that's been presented as a white paper and also submitted to an academic conference on how we've been building out this medical dictionary to help with sentiment analysis for these different patients. And so this is just another interesting and very different sphere of research that ultimately comes down to, we rely on this infrastructure, in this case, it's digital health infrastructure for information, for support for our communities. And how do we make sure that it's relevant and safe and secure? How do we make sure that it's consistent? How do we make sure there's no misinformation in there? And this is kind of the theme that we try and tackle in our breaker space. So with that, I'll open the floor to any questions. Thanks so much for joining today. And I look forward to meeting you all in person, hopefully in the future. Thanks.
Greg.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have some related questions for you, Greg. Thank you for the talk, first of all.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So with smart cities, what do you consider to be the ultimate killer apps for smart cities? Number one. Number two, do you think that the sidewalk project from Google got close to that, to achieving that? And thirdly, why are many of the so-called smart city projects we're hearing today just kind of boring, not really getting into the range of the killer apps that many of us anticipate?
Three good questions that I may forget along the way. So I'll try and start with the first one, and, and then I'll address each. So the first one is, what is the killer app? In my opinion, the killer app is possibly the most boring app, but also the most fundamental, which is the ability to do this, the actuation integration across disparate vendors. And so right now you have a whole bunch of people developing use cases. And so the smart city domain is clouded by a whole bunch of pilots. There's pilots everywhere. We used to call it death by pilot. And so everyone's trying new little use cases here and there, but none of it's integrated. So there's no like actual feel for what is a smart city. A smart city is a interconnection of a whole bunch of services that are at individuals' fingertips, and people feel the impact of. And there isn't a way right now for anyone to actually feel that anything's smart, because everything is totally disparate and disconnected. It's decentralized on purpose, but at the same time, there needs to be a way for people to access these services. And no one's really standing up to kind of create that massive integration component. So it's not the most sexy use case necessarily, but it is the most important to make it feel like there is a smart city. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, so it does. And yeah, it does sound boring because it's sort of a layer removed from the good stuff.
Yeah.
So what do you consider to be the best part of the sidewalk project from Google? And I'm asking, I don't remember all the details, but was there something that really stood out to you that you think should be pursued? And then why are other cities, their vision for smart cities, in my opinion, is really boring. It's improved access, which is good, and smart streetlights and maybe smarter traffic signals and, things like that. So talk to us about sidewalk, the most exciting aspects of sidewalk and why other cities are a lot less ambitious.
Yeah, so sidewalk, when it first started, it was created out of a acquisition of a company called the Control Group. It was based in New York City. I was friendly with the founding team of it, and they built out the infrastructure for Link New York City. Link New York City was supposed to provide, and I guess it technically still today provides gigabit public Wi-Fi for New York. And they set up these kiosks. They replaced all of these individual telephone booths so that people were able to access it. Internet and actually have this nice little display. They can charge their phone on it. There was actually like a little computer in there. They can check things out. And so this is kind of the acquisition that kind of kickstarted Sidewalk. And part of the vision for Sidewalk in this part of this was have these kiosks be maybe the hub of what can be a whole bunch of smart city use cases. And I think the most exciting one that had always come up was the one about public safety, connecting public safety, and where it was brilliant and also kind of flawed at the same time was that it had to do with this mass surveillance or what they call anonymized surveillance of public events. And so when you have massive public events, especially in crowded areas, you don't really know exactly what's going on, but there happens to be a lot of theft or there happens to be a lot of challenges in there. People exploit those situations. And so one of the Sidewalk use cases that they had been designing out was how do you do this in a robust and non-biased way that would actually be able to help deploy safety professionals and policemen and women to the scene when things go wrong. Now, this is something that I think that they're still quietly pursuing, at least from a technology front. However, they ran into so many political challenges with this because of the ideas behind, or some of the buzzwords behind surveillance, generally speaking. And so this is actually one of the reasons why a lot of Sidewalk projects have failed in the past, is because they weren't able to get that public partnership with the public, that build that public trust to be actually able to drive programs like this. But that's like one of the most impactful smart city programs that Sidewalk was offering at the time. And I think that there's a whole bunch of opportunity for them to continue doing so, but it really has to build the trust out for the communities for that. And your second question on what the other question,
Why
sorry,
cities are coming up with really
yeah,
boring ideas?
because they've been well, the main reason is because they had these ideas. The reason why they're boring is because they had these ideas 15 years ago and they weren't able to execute on them. And they realized that they can't do any of the more exciting ideas until they have some of the more boring stuff. And I think that's actually one of the biggest reasons why, because they haven't been able to get some of the boring stuff right. The use cases that can be transformative also are mired in regulatory challenges. And so one of the big concerns you have when you're dealing with smart cities is that you're not just beholden to the city, but you're beholden to state regulators and federal regulatory agencies. And so some of the coolest use cases that I've seen about how do you deploy UAVs in certain, again, emergency response happens to be a really exciting field. You just can't get through the red tape of the bureaucracy of the cities and also the government agencies. So kind of driving that partnership with the people, but also with the governments is what's kind of holding a lot of these cool use cases back, I would say.
So Greg, this is Randall. We talked a lot about places where government works and where there's investment in infrastructure, and yet there's critical infrastructure in places where government doesn't work and where there's not a lot of investment. So if you're looking at Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, how should we build infrastructure there with such limited capital and the exposure that if you're not going to invest seriously, that you're not going to be able to harden your infrastructure from attack?
Yeah, investment's obviously always a big issue. And ways that I've seen it work in Sub-Saharan Africa is by driving things through community engagement. And that's where, again, the trust in building community partnerships with those who are going to actually be using the technology is really critical. A really cool case study here is I had someone who used to work with me, work on my team at Accenture. He left to go work on a startup in Sub-Saharan Africa that was trying to deliver renewable energy systems to homes because there was a whole bunch of fires because people still use kerosene there to light their homes to a large extent. And so in order to have actually created this change and prompted the change that they were trying to create, they went to the community and they started asking, like, what can you afford if you really wanted something? And they said, well, we can afford as much as we pay for our phone bills. And so the team started thinking a bit and said, okay, well, if they can't really afford more than their phone bills, but they all have phones, right? They all have connectivity to some extent, or at least someone in the community has connectivity. Is there a way that you can bake in energy infrastructure and payments for energy infrastructure as part of the existing phone plan? So partnerships began to be built across whoever was the phone carrier in this region and the startup to be able to kind of develop these solar panels that were paid off over time by a percentage of your phone usage. And so whenever people didn't use part of their phone bill as a pay-as-you-go, they were able to put that allocation over to pay for some of these tiny little battery chargers that would be able to charge their phones. Because guess what? Phones don't work without batteries, right? And so it was really hard for people to start to be able to use their phones consistently without having the charging infrastructure for it. And so it kind of started to drive the question of, well, what did the people really, really fundamentally want and need? And what were they actually, based off of their ability to pay, what were their limits? And how would we be able to make priority, how would we prioritize use cases that would actually fit and fill these requirements? A human-centric design approach to smart cities, right? A real human-centric design approach. And so the company that my buddy was out working with ultimately was able to scale this approach by selling these little batteries along with the telcos to these community centers that would just be offsetting some of the payment each month for the charging infrastructure, so people would use more data and pay for more for data for communications ultimately, because they saw more value to that than they saw in even the electricity. they were able to scale this to 3 different countries in Africa. And it was recently bought by Engie, which is a major utility in Europe. And so that was an approach and a cool case study of like, yeah, that they didn't really have a lot of capital, but they knew what the community was working with. They knew what the community's priorities were, and took this real human-centric design approach to being able to actually build out what they cared about. Hopefully that answers the question and gives an interesting case study at the same time.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Any other questions? If not, folks are always welcome to send me an email or find me at the lab. And we're based at the Steve Silver building, and I spend most of my time there. So feel free to always come knock on our doors. But really enjoyed speaking with you all today. Please feel free to follow up with any questions you have.
Scott, is there a question in that room? All right, so thank you very much, Greg. We are at time, and so that was delightful and thought-provoking. And we also need to get you involved in the loan. So Steve is a mere electric skateboard ride away. So
Looking forward to seeing everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.